Hello and welcome back to Hegelians of the Storm, Part 8. Have you asked yourself the question of who benefits from everyone being in a state of constant surveillance? If not, I would suggest that you probably do. Anyways, we're jumping in at section 255, Part AA, Certainty and the Truth of Reason, of G.W.F. Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit. I do hope that you enjoyed today's reading and you learned something that you didn't know before. Section 255. The sides of the law which the reason instinct here proceeds to observe are as follows from this determination: initially organic nature and inorganic nature in their relation to one another. The latter is, for organic nature, just the freedom, a freedom opposed to the simple concept of organic nature, to the detached determinancies in which the individual nature is at the same time dissolved, and from the continuity of which it at the same time breaks away and is for itself. Air, water, earth, zones, and climate are such universal elements which constitute the indeterminate simple essences of individualities, and in which these individualities are at the same time reflected into themselves. Neither the individuality nor the elemental is simply in and for itself. On the contrary, in the independent freedom in which for observation they enter the lists against each other, they behave at the same time as essential relations, but in such a way that the independence and mutual indifference of the two are the predominant feature, and only in part pass into abstraction. Here, then, the law is present as the relation of an element to the formation of the organic, which at one time has the elemental being over against it, and at another time exhibits it within its organic reflection. Quick pause from the actual reading. So we're setting up this idea of essential relationships, and he uses this idea of the inorganic elemental and also conceptual of being the oh god, what was it? So air, water, earth, fire, so the elements, and then also zones, so regions where those elements interact, and then also climate. These are the examples of the non-physical, or of the inorganic conditions that then go on to shape a what is called a simple concept of organic nature. So these immaterial, or these material forces, will go on to shape biological forces, organic forces. So organic versus inorganic, and using the law, a set of written rules, potentially as an inorganic set of structures to create an organic society. Returning back to the reading. But laws of this kind, that animals belong to the air have the constitution of birds, those belonging to water have the constitution of fish, that Nordic animals have thick hairy pelts, and so on, such laws at once display a poverty which does not correspond to the organic manifold variety. Besides the fact that organic freedom knows how to withdraw its forms from these determinations again, and everywhere necessarily presents exceptions to such laws, or rules as we might like to call them, this remains, even for the creatures which these laws do apply to, such a superficial determination that even the expression of the necessity of the laws cannot be other than superficial, and does not get any further than great influence. And this does not tell us what strictly belongs to this influence and what does not. Such relations of the organic to the elemental cannot therefore in fact be called laws, for, first, as we mentioned, such a relation, in its content, does not exhaust the range of the organic in the least, but secondly, even the moments of the relation itself remain mutually indifferent and express no necessity. In the concept of acid lies the concept of base, just as negative electricity lies in the concept of positive electricity. But however often the thick, hairy pelt is encountered together with the north, or the structure of fish together with water, the structure of birds together with air, Still, the concept of thick hair does not lie in the concept of north. The concept of the structure of fish does not lie in the concept of sea. The concept of the structure of birds does not lie in the concept of air. Because of this freedom of because of this freedom of the two sides with respect to each other, there are also land animals which have the essential characteristics of a bird, of the fish, and so on. The necessity, because it cannot be comprehended as an inner necessity of the essence, also ceases to have sensory being there, and can no longer be observed in actuality, but has withdrawn from it. Having thus no place in the real essence itself, the necessity is what is called a a teleological teleological what is called a teleological relation, a relation which is external to the related terms, and therefore really the contrary of a law. It is the thought um, it is the thought completely liberated from necessary nature, a thought which abandons this necessary nature and moves above it for itself. If the above mentioned relation of the organic to elemental nature does not express the essence of the organic is, by contrast, contained in the purpose concept. It is true that for this observing consciousness, this concept is not the organic's own essence, but again falls outside it, and is then only that external teleological relation. Yet the organic, as it has been determined above, is in fact the real purpose itself. For since the organic itself preserves itself in the relation to another, it is just as natural essence in which nature reflects itself into the concept, and the moments separated from each other in necessity, of a cause and effect, of an agent and patient, are brought together into unity, so that here something emerges not merely as a result of necessity, but because it has returned into itself, the last, or the result, is just as much the first, which begins the movement, and is to itself the purpose which it actualizes. The organic does not produce something, but only preserves itself, or what is produced is as much already present as it is produced. We must examine more closely this determination, as it is in itself, and as it is for the reason instinct, in order to see how the latter finds itself therein, but does not recognize itself in what it finds. The purpose concept, then, to which observing reason ascends, is reason's the purpose concept, then, to which observing reason ascends, is reason's conscious concept, but it is also no less present as an actuality. It is not and is not just an external relation of this actuality, but its essence. This actuality, for which itself a purpose, is related purposefully to another, which means its which means its relation is a contingent relation with respect to what both immediately are. Immediately, both are independent and mutually indifferent, but the essence of their relation is something other than what they thus seem to be, and their doing has another sense than what it is immediately for sense perception. The necessity is hidden in what happens, and shows itself only in the end, but in such a way that just this end shows that the necessity has also been what is first. The end, however, shows this priority of itself by the fact that through the alteration that the doing has undertaken, nothing else emerges than what was already there. Or, if we start from what is first, then in this its end, or in the result of its doing, returns only to itself, and through this very fact it demonstrates itself to be something that has its own self for its end, and thus, as first, has already returned to itself, or is in and for itself. Therefore, what arrives at through the movement of its doing is itself, and that it arrives only at itself is its self feeling. With this, there is certainty present between the distinction With this, there is certainly present the distinction between what it is and what it seeks, but this is merely the semblance of a distinction, and is thereby concept within its own self. But this is just how self consciousness is constituted. It distinguishes itself from itself in such a manner that at the same time no distinction emerges in it. Hence, it finds in observation of organic nature nothing else than its essence. It finds itself as a thing, as a life, but still makes a distinction between what it is itself and what it has found, a distinction, however, which is no distinction. Just as the instinct of the animal seeks and consumes food, but thereby brings forth nothing other than itself, so too the instinct of reason in its quest finds only reason itself. The animal finishes up with self feeling. The reason instinct, on the other hand, is at the same time self consciousness, but because it is only instinct, it is put on one side over against consciousness, and has its opposition in it. Its satisfaction is therefore divided by this opposition. It does indeed find itself vis-a-vis the purpose, and likewise this purpose as thing. But first, for the instinct of the purpose falls But first, for the instinct, the purpose falls outside the thing, which presents itself as purpose. Secondly, this purpose as purpose is at the same time objective, and therefore, and for the instinct, therefore it does not fall within itself as consciousness either, but in another understanding. Examined more closely, this determination lies just as much in the concept of the thing, that of being in its own self a purpose, that is to say, that is to say, it preserves itself, i.e., it is at one and the same time its nature to conceal the necessity and to exhibit it in the form of a contingent relation, for its freedom, or its being for itself, is just this, to treat its necessity as a matter of indifference. Thus it presents itself as something whose concept falls outside its being. Similarly, though, it has the necessity of intuiting its own concept as falling outside it, hence as a thing, as something towards which it is indifferent, and which is therefore reciprocally indifferent towards reason and towards its concept. As instinct, reason also remains inside this being or indifference, and the thing that expresses the concept remains for it something other than this concept, and the concept other than the thing. Thus, for reason, the organic thing is in its own self a purpose only in the sense that the necessity which presents itself as hidden in the doing of the thing, since the doer behaves in it as an indifferent being for itself, falls outside the organic itself. Since, however, the organic as a purpose in its own self cannot behave in any other way than as such a thing, it is apparent and sensorily it is apparent and sensorially present that it is a purpose in its own self, and it is thus observed. The organic shows itself to be something that preserves itself and returns, and has returned, into itself. But this observing consciousness does not recognize in this being the purpose concept, or the fact that the purpose concept does not exist somewhere else in an understanding, but exists right here, and is as a thing. It draws a distinction between the purpose concept and, on the one hand, and being for itself and self preservation on the other. A distinction which again is no distinction. That it is no distinction is not for this consciousness, but what is for it is a doing that appears contingent and indifferent with regard to what comes about through it, and the unity which nevertheless links the two together, that doing and this purpose falls asunder for this consciousness. On this view, what belongs to the organic itself is the doing lying in the middle between its first and last term, insofar as this doing has in the character of singularity. Insofar, however, as the doing has the character of universality, and the doer is equated with what is produced through it, Purposive doing as such would not belong to the organic. That singular doing, which is only a means, passes in virtue of its singularity, under the determination of an altogether singular or contingent necessity. What the organic does for the preservation of itself as individual, or itself as genus, is therefore, as regards this immediate content, entirely lawless for the universal, and the concept falls outside it. Accordingly, its doing would be an empty functioning devoid of any content within itself. It would not even be the functioning of a machine, for this has a purpose, and its functioning therefore has a determinate content. Abandoned in this way by the universal, it would be the activity merely of a being as a being, i.e., an activity that is not at the same time reflected into itself, as an activity of an acid or base is a functioning which could not separate itself from its immediate being there, nor give up this being there, which gets lost in the relation to its opposite, yet still preserves itself. But the being whose functioning is the functioning considered here is posited as a thing that preserves itself in its relation to its opposite. The activity, as such, is nothing but the pure essenceless form of its being for itself, and its substance, which is not merely determinate being, but the universal, its purpose, does not fall outside it. It is an activity which within itself returns into itself and is not turned back into itself by anything alien. However, this unity of universality and the activity is not for the observing consciousness, because that unity is essentially the inner movement of the organic and can only be conceived as concept. But observation seeks the moments in the form of being and permanence, and because it is essential to the organic whole that it does not have the moments in it in this form and does not let them be found in it, consciousness converts the opposition into an opposition that conforms to its own point of view. In this way, the organic essence arises for observing consciousness as a relation of two fixed moments that simply are. Again, in this way, the organic essence arises for observing consciousness as the relation of two fixed moments that simply are, an opposition whose two sides thus seem, on the one hand, to be given to it in observation, and on the other hand, their as regards their context, express the opposition of the organic purpose concept and of actuality. But because the concept is such but because the concept as such is effaced therein, they express them in an obscure and superficial way, in which thought has sunk to the level of representation. Thus, we see that the concept is roughly what is meant by the inner, and actuality by the outer, and their relation generates the law that the outer is the expression of the inner. When we consider more closely this inner with its opposite and their relation to each other, it emerges that, in the first place, the sides of the law no longer function as in the case of previous laws, in which they appeared as independent things, each as a particular body, nor, in the second place, in such way that the universal is supposed to have its existence somewhere else, that being outside beings. On the contrary, the organic essence is made the foundation, entirely unseparated, as content of the inner and outer, and is the same for both. The opposition is thus still only a purely formal one, whose real sides have the same in itself for their essence, but at the same time, since inner and outer are also an opposed reality and a diverse being for observation, they each seem to they each seem to They each seem, according to observation, to have a peculiar content of their own. However, this peculiar content, since it is the same substance or organic unity, that can in fact only be a diverse form of that substance, of that unity, and this is implied by the observing consciousness when it says that the outer is merely the expression of the inner. These are the same determinations of the relationship vis-a-vis the indifferent independence of the diverse terms and their unity in that independence, a unity in which they vanish, that we have seen in the purpose concept. We have now to see what shape the inner and outer have in their being. The inner as such must have an outer being and a shape, just as much as the outer as such, for it is an object, or is itself posited as being and as present for observation. Quick pause. I think with that sentence, you get the entirety, or those two sentences there, you get the entirety of Elden Ring's lore. If you get that sentence, 264, section 264, Phenomenology of the Spirit, you get all of Elden Ring's lore. Total spoilers. Not sorry. Jumping back to it. 265. The organic substance as inner is the simple soul, the pure purpose concept or the universal, which in its partition equally remains a universal fluidity, and therefore appears in its being as the doing or the movement of the vanishing actuality, whereas the outer, opposed to that inner that simply is, consists in the quiescent being of the organic. The law, as the relation of that inner to this outer, thus expresses its content, once in the presentation of universal moments or simple essentialities, and again in the presentation of the actualized essentiality or the shape. Those first simple organic properties, if we may call them that, are sensibility, irritability, and reproduction. These properties, at least the first two, seem indeed to relate not to the organism in general, but only to the animal organism. In fact, the vegetable organism also expresses only the simple concept of the organism, which does not develop its moments. Consequently, in regard to those moments, so far as they are supposed to be for observation, we must confine ourselves to the organism which presents their developed being there. Now, I do want to hit a quick pause because, again, this is 1850 and study of consciousness hasn't gone as far as it has today, where we've now gotten to really fun stuff. Really fun stuff being that we know that animals are conscious. We know that they have the same quantum effects of consciousness that like human consciousness does. So what that means to say is that of all the animal species and blah 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 blah, there is no difference in consciousness, in the effect that consciousness has on reality. That's cool. Also, there's a wonderful essay that I will, or a wonderful presentation that I'll link in the bio for people to watch on plant consciousness as well, because I just watched it. It comes from, I can't remember exactly at this time, so I'll probably flash the name up on the screen for everyone to see right now. Um, and they talk about the um, the intelligence of plants and the studies that have gone in to showing that plants not only are intelligent, but they are also conscious in the same way that animals, um, in the same way that all animals are as well. It's just a different type of intelligence. It's a different type of conscious, or it's not a. It may not be a different type of consciousness, because again, the effects of consciousness are uniform across everything that experiences that consciousness. But the different degrees of which intelligence and our relationship to the word intelligence and all that stuff absolutely changes. So thank you for this brief departure because I couldn't from the reading because I couldn't take that Hegel was kind of bashing plants there. Um, plants are our some of our older siblings, and they are very much watching over us with curiosity, and probably a morbid curiosity as they are more or less powerless to stop our destruction of our shared world. On that joyous note, let's jump back into the reading. 266. Now, as regards these moments, Now, as regards these moments themselves, they immediately emerge from the concept of the end in itself, for sensibility expresses in general the simple concept of the organic reflection into itself, or the universal fluidity of this concept, while irritability expresses organic elasticity, the capacity in reflection at the same time to behave reactively, and the actualization opposed to the initial quiescent being within itself, an actualization in which that abstract being for itself is a being for another. Reproduction, however, is the action of this whole organism reflected into itself, its activity as purpose in itself, or as genus, in which the individual thus repels itself from itself and reproduces by engendering them either its organic parts or the whole individual. Reproduction, taking in the meaning of self preservation in general, expresses the formal concept of the organic or sensibility, but it is, strictly speaking, the real organic concept, or the whole, which returns into itself, either as the individual by producing the singular parts of itself, or as genus by producing other individuals. The other meaning of these organic elements, vis a vis as the outer, is the mode of their shape, according to which they are present as actual parts, but at the same time as universal parts or organic systems, sensibility, say, as a nervous system, irritability as a muscular system, and reproduction as viscera for the preservation of the individual and the genus. Laws peculiar to the organic accordingly concern a relationship of the organic moments in their twofold meaning, once as being a part of the organic structure, and again as being a universal fluid determinacy which pervades all those systems. Thus, in the expression of such a law, a determinate sensibility, ergo, as a moment of the whole organism, would have its expression in a determinately formed nervous system, or it would also be linked with a determinate reproduction of the organic parts of the individual, or with the propagation of the whole individual, and so on. Both sides of such a law can be observed. The outer, in accordance with its concept, is being for another sensibility, ergo, has its immediately actualized mode in the sensitive system, and as a universal property, it is in its externalizations equally something objective. The side which is called the inner has its own outer side, which is distinct from what is called the outer in the whole. Both sides of an organic law would thus no doubt be observable, but not in the laws of their relation. And observation does not suffice, not because, as observation, it is too short sighted, and we ought not proceed empirically, but ought to start from the idea is capitalized, for such laws. If they were something real, it would have in fact to be actually present and therefore observable, but rather because the thought of laws of this kind proves to have no truth. There turned out to be a law in the relationship according to which the universal organic property in an organic system had made itself into a thing, and in this thing had a structured imprint, so that both were the same essence, present one moment as the universal present once as a universal moment and again as a thing. But in addition, the side of the inner is, for itself, also a relationship of several sides, and consequently there presents to itself and consequently there presents itself, to begin with, the thought of a law as a relation to one another of the universal organic activities or properties. Whether such a law is possible must be decided from the nature of such a property. However, such a property as a universal fluidity is, on the one hand, not something that is limited in the manner of a thing and sticks to the difference of a being there, which is supposed to constitute its shape, sensibility, and extends beyond the nervous system and permeates all other systems of the organism. On the other hand, this property as a universal moment which is essentially unseparated and inseparable from reaction or irritability, and from reproduction. For as reflection into itself, it is it purely and simply has reaction in it. Mere reflectedness into itself is passivity or dead being, not a sensibility, any more than an action which is the same as reaction, without reflectedness into itself, is irritability. It is precisely reflection in action or reaction, and action or reaction in reflection, whose unity constitutes the organic, a unity which is synonymous with organic reproduction. It follows from this that in every mode of actuality the same quantity of sensibility of ugh, the same quantity of sensibility of oh man the same quantity of sensibility as of irritability must be present, since to begin with we are considering the relationship of sensibility and irritability to one another, and that an organic phenomenon can be apprehended and determined, or, if you'd like, explained, just as much in terms of the one as of the other. What one person takes, say, for high sensibility, another may equally well consider as high irritability, and high irritability of the same degree. If they are called factors, and this is not to be a meaningless word, they are thereby declared to be moments of the concept. Thus, the real object whose essence is constituted by this concept has them in it in an equal way, and if the object is determined in the one way as very sensitive, it must also be declared in the other way to be equally irritable. Just like me for real. If sensibility and irritability are distinguished, as is necessary, then they are distinguished in accordance with the concept and their opposition as qualitative. But when apart from this true difference, they are also posited as beings and diverse for representation, such that they could be sides of the law, then they appear in quantitative diversity. Their peculiar qualitative opposition thus enters into a magnitude, and there arise laws of the kind, for example, that sensibility and irritability stand at an inverse relationship of their magnitude, so that as one grows the other decreases, or better, taking directly the magnitude itself as the content, that the size of something increases as its smallness decreases. But if a determinate content is given to this law, say that the size of a whole increases, the more what is filled with the more what it is filled with decreases, then this inverse relationship can equally be changed into a direct relationship and expressed by saying that the size of the whole increases in direct relationship to the amount taken away. A tautological proposition, whether expressed as a direct or inverse relationship, a proposition which in its peculiar expression means simply this, that a quantity increases as this quantity increases. Just as the whole and what fills it and what is taken away are quantitatively opposed, but what is real in them and its determinate quantity is one and the same in both, and similarly increase the magnitude and decrease of smallness are the same, and their meaningless opposition amounts to a tautology. So are the organic moments equally inseparable in their reality and in their magnitude, which is the magnitude of that reality. One decreases only with the other, and increases only with it, for one purely and simply has meaning only in so far as the other is present, or rather, it is a matter of indifference whether an organic phenomenon is considered as irritability or as sensibility. So is this is so in general, and equally when its magnitude is under discussion. Similarly, as the Similarly, it is a matter of indifference whether we speak of the increase of the whole as an augmentation of the whole, as the emptiness, or as an augmentation of the filling removed, or a number, ergo 3, remains equally large whether I take it positively or negatively, and if I enlarge the 3 to 4, then both the positive and the negative have become 4. Just as the south pole of a magnet is exactly as strong as its north pole, or a positive electricity or an acid is exactly as strong as its negative or the base on which it acts, An organic being there is just such a magnitude as that 3, or as the magnet, etc. It is that which is augmented or diminished, and when it is augmented, both its factors are augmented, just as both poles of the magnet or both electricities increase if a magnet, etc., is strengthened. That the two can be diverse is just as little intention and extension. That the one cannot decrease in extension but increase in intention, while the other conversely is supposed to diminish its intention but increases in extension, falls under the same concept of empty opposition. The real intention is purely and simply as great as the extension, and vice versa. It is evident that what really happens in this law giving is that at the outset, irritability and sensibility constitute a determinate organic opposition, but this content gets lost and the opposition degenerates into the formal opposition of the increase and decrease of quantity, or of diverse intention, and extension. An opposition which no longer has anything to do with the nature of sensibility and irritability and no longer expresses it. Hence, such an empty game of law giving is not confined to the organic moments, but can be played everywhere and with everything, and rests in general on unfamiliarity with the logical nature of these oppositions. Finally, if instead of sensibility and irritability, reproduction is brought into the relation with one or the other of them, then even the occasion for this law giving falls away, for reproduction does not stand in opposition to those moments as they do to one another, and since this law giving is based on such an opposition, here even the semblance of its taking place falls away. The law giving, just considered, contains the differences of the organism in their significance as moments of its concept, and strictly speaking should be an a priori law giving, but the law giving itself essentially involves this thought that those differences have the significance of present givens, and that the merely observing consciousness has, in any case, to confine itself only to their being there. The organic actuality necessarily contains such an opposition as its concept expresses, and which can be determined as irritability and sensibility, as both of these in turn appear diverse from reproduction. The externality in which the moments of the organic concept are here considered is the inner's own immediate externality, not the outer, which is the outer of the whole, and is shape, and in relation with which the inner is to be considered later on. If, however, the opposition of the moments is conceived as it is in the being there, then sensibility, irritability, reproduction sink down to the level of common properties, which are universalities equally indifferent towards one another as a determinate weight, color, hardness, etc. In this sense, it may well be observed that an organic entity is more sensitive or more irritable or of greater reproductive force than another, just as we may observe that the sensibility, etc., of one is diverse in kind from that other, that one reacts differently to determinate stimuli than another, as a horse reacts differently to oats than to hay, and a dog again differently to both, etc. Differences as readily observable as that one body is harder than another, and so on. But these sensory properties, hardness, color, etc., all, as also the phenomena of receptivity to the stimulus of oats, or irritability in response to loads, or of the number and kind of young produced, when they are related to one another and compared among themselves, essentially conflict without any essentially conflict with any conformity to a law, for the determinacy of their sensory being just consists in their existing in complete mutual indifference, and displaying the freedom of nature released from the concept rather than the unity of a relation, displaying their irrational playing up and down the scale of contingent magnitude between the moments of the concept rather than these moments themselves. The other side, according to which the simple moments of the organic concept are compared with the moments of the structure, would first furnish the authentic law expressing the true outer as a copy of the inner. Now, because those simple moments are interpreting. Oh, wow. Now, because those simple moments are interpenetrating fluid properties. Now, because those simple moments are interpenetrating fluid properties, they do not have the organic thing, such as oh my god. They do not have in the organic thing such a separate, real expression as what is called a singular system of the shape. Or if the abstract idea of the organism is genuinely expressed in those three moments, merely because they are not anything static, but only moments of the concept and of movement, then the organism, on the other hand, as a structure, is not captured in three such determinate systems as anatomy ex- anatomy explicates from them. Insofar as such systems are supposed to be found in their actuality, and to be legitimated by being so found, it must also be borne in mind that anatomy presents us not only with three such systems, but with a good many more. Furthermore, apart from this, the system of sensibility in general must mean something quite different from what is called the nervous system. Similarly, the irritable system, something different from the muscular system, the reproductive system, something different from the viscera of reproduction. In the systems of shape as such, the organism is apprehended from the abstract side of dead existence. Its moments taken in this way belong to anatomy and the cadaver, not to cognition and the living organism. As such parts, the moments have really ceased to be, for they cease to be processes. Since the being of this organism is essentially universality or reflection into itself, the being of its whole, like its moments, cannot consist in an anatomical system. On the contrary, the actual expression of the whole and the externalization of its moments are really present only as a movement which runs its course through the various parts of the structure, a movement in which what is carved out and fixed as singular system essentially displays itself as a fluid moment. Consequently, this actuality, as anatomy finds it, must not rank as their reality, but only that actuality as a process, in which alone even the anatomical parts make any sense. It emerges then, first, that the moments of the organic inner, taken for themselves, are incapable of furnishing the sides of a law of being, since in such a law the sides should have been able to be asserted of a being there, to be distinguished from one another, and neither side to be equally named in place of the other; and secondly, that placed on one side, the moments do not have in the other side their realization in a fixed system. For such a system is no more something that would have any organic truth than it is the expression of those moments of the inner. The essence of the organic, since it is in itself the universal, rather consists in general in having its moments just as universal in actuality, i.e., as pervasive processes, but not in giving an image of the universal in an isolated thing. In this way, the representation of a law in the organic gets lost altogether. The law wants to grasp and express the opposition as inert sides, and in them the determinacy which is their relation to one another, the inner to which the appearing universality belongs, and the outer to which the parts of the inert shape were supposed to constitute the corresponding sides of the law, but as thus held apart, they lose their organic significance, and what underlies the representation of law is precisely this, that each of its two sides should have an indifferent subsistence for subsistence that is for itself, the relation being shared between them as a twofold determinacy corresponding to that relation, whereas each side of the organic is intrinsically just this, to be simple universality, in which all determinations are dissolved, and to be the movement of this dissolution. Insight into the indifference between this law giving and previous forms will make its nature perfectly clear. if namely we look back to the movement of the perceiving and of the understanding, which in perception reflects itself into itself and thereby determines its object. The understanding does not there have before itself in its object the relation of these abstract determinations, of the universal and the singular, of the essential and the external. It is itself the transition, to which this transition does not become objective. Here, by contrast, the organic unity, i.e., just the relation of those opposites, and this relation is purely transition, is itself the object. The transition in its simplicity is immediately universality, and since this universality enters into the difference whose relation the law is supposed to express, its moments, as universal, are objects of this consciousness. And the law runs, the outer is the expression of the inner. Here the understanding has grasped the thought of the law itself, whereas previously it only looked for laws generally, and the moments of the laws occurred to it as a determinate content, not as the thoughts of the laws. As regards to the content, then, the laws obtained here ought not to be such as are merely a tranquil admission of differences that simply are into the form of universality, but laws which immediately have in these differences the unrest of the concept too, and consequently at the same time have in the necessity of the relation between sides. But just because the object, the organic unity, immediately unites the infinite sublation or the absolute negation of being with inert being, and the moments are essentially pure transition, no sides that simply are emerge such as required for the law. In order to obtain such sides, the understanding must keep to the moment of the organic relationship, vis a vis to the reflectedness of organic being there into itself. But this being is so completely reflected into itself that no determinacy with regard to another is left over for it. The immediate sensory being is immediately one with the determinacy as such, and therefore expresses a qualitative difference in that being, as ergo, blue in contrast to red, acid in contrast to alkaline, and so on. But the organic being that has returned into itself is completely indifferent towards another. Its being there is a simple universality that denies to observation any lasting sensory differences, or, what is the same thing, displays as essential determinancy only as the exchange of determinancies that are. Consequently, express the way in which difference expresses itself as being is just this, that it is an indifferent difference, i.e., difference as magnitude. In this, however, the concept is extinguished and necessity has vanished. But the content and filling of this indifferent being, the exchange of sensory determinations, gathered together into the simplicity of an organic determination, then expresses this at the same time, that the content really does not have that determinacy, that of the immediate property, and the qualitative element falls solely in the magnitude, as we saw above. Although, then, the objective element, which is apprehended as organic determinacy, has the concept within itself, and thereby distinguishes itself from what is for the understanding, that in apprehending the content of its laws behaves as purely perceptual, nevertheless this apprehension relapses entirely into the principle and the manner of the merely perceiving understanding, for the reason that what is apprehended is utilized as moments of a law, for what is apprehended thereby acquires the mode of a fixed determinacy, the form of an immediate property or of an inert appearance. It is furthermore received into the determination of magnitude, and the nature of the concept is suppressed. The conversion of something merely perceived into something reflected into itself, of a merely sensory determinacy into an organic determinacy, thus loses its value again, and loses it by a fact and loses it by the fact that the understanding has not yet sublated law giving. To draw comparison with regard to this conversation by some examples, Perhaps something which for perception is an animal with strong muscles is determined as an animal organism of high irritability, or what for perception is a condition of great weakness is determined as a condition of high sensibility, or, if one prefers, as an abnormal affection, and indeed an exponentiation of it, expressions which translate the sensory facts into Latin, and a bad Latin at that, instead of into the concept. That an animal has strong muscles may also be expressed by the understanding by saying that the animal possesses a great muscular force, and similarly great weakness is a slight force. Determination in terms of irritability has this advantage over determination as force, that the latter expresses indeterminate but the former determinate reflection into itself, for the peculiar force of the muscle is precisely irritability. And it has the advantage over determination by that of strong muscles, that reflection into itself and is at the same time contained in it as it is already in force. Similarly, weakness or slight force, organic passivity, finds determinate expression in terms of sensibility. But when this sensibility is so taken for itself and fixed, and in addition is bound up with magnitude, and as greater or lesser sensibility is opposed to a greater or lesser irritability, each is wholly reduced into the sensory element and to the ordinary form of a property, and their relation is not the concept but, on the contrary, magnitude, into which the opposition now falls and becomes a thoughtless difference. Though the indeterminacy of the expressions force and strength and weakness was thereby removed, there now arises the equally empty and indeterminate dabbling in the oppositions of a higher and lower sensibility and irritability, in their ascent and descent relatively to one another. Just as strength and weakness are entirely sensory thoughtless determinations, greater or lesser sensibility and irritability are no less the sensory appearance thoughtlessly apprehended and likewise expressed. Those concept those conceptless expressions have not been replaced by the concept. Instead, strength and weakness have been filled with a determination which, taken solely for itself, is based on the concept and has it at its content, but loses completely this origin and character, by the form of simplicity and immediacy in which this content is made into the side of a law, and by the magnitude that constitutes the element of the difference of such determinations, the essence, which is originally as concept and posited as concept, retains the mode of sensory perceiving, and remains as far removed from cognition as it was in the determination by strength and weakness of force or by immediate sensory properties. Now, there still remains to be considered for itself alone what the outer and the organic is, and how in the opposition of its inner and outer determines itself, just as at first the inner of the whole in relation to its own outer was considered. The outer, considered for itself, is the structure in general, the system of life articulating itself in the element of being, and at the same time essentially the being of the organic essence for another, objective essence in its being for itself. This other appears initially as its outer inorganic nature. If these two are considered in relation to a law, the organic nature cannot, as we saw above, constitute the side of a law over against the organic essence, because the latter is at the same time and simply for itself, and has a universal and free relation to inorganic organic nature. If the relationship of these two sides in the organic shape itself is determinacy more closely, then this shape is, on one side, turned against the inorganic nature, while on the other side it is for itself and reflected into itself. The actual organic essence is the middle term which unites the being for itself of life with the actual outer in general or being in itself. The extreme of being for itself, however, the inner as infinite one, which takes back into itself, out of their subsistence and connection with the outer, the moments of the shape itself, this extreme, devoid of content of its own, gives itself its content in the shape and appears in the shape as its process. In this extreme, as simple negativity or pure singularity, the organic has its absolute freedom in virtue of which it is indifferent and secured with regard to being for another, and with regard to the determinacy of the moments of the shape. This freedom is at the same time freedom of the moments themselves. It is their possibility of appearing and being apprehended as being there, and in this they are also liberated and indifferent with regard to one another, just as they are with regard to the outer, for the simplicity of this freedom is being, or their simple substance. This concept, or pure freedom, is one and the same life. However varied the play in which the shape or the being for another may rove about, it is a matter of indifference to the stream of life what kind of mills it drives. Now, in the first place, it is to be noted that this concept is not to be conceived here as it was formerly, when we were considering the proper inner and its form of process, or the development of its moments, but in its form as simple inner, which constitutes the purely universal side in contrast to the actual living essence, or as the element in which the members of the shape, which simply are, have their subsistence. For it is this shape that we are considering here, and in the essence of life is as the simplicity of subsistence. In the next place, the being for another, or the determinacy of the actual structure, is taken up into this simple universality, which is its essence, a determinacy which is equally simple, universal, and non sensory, and can only be the determinacy which is expressed as number. The number is the middle term of the shape which links the indeterminate life with the actual life, simple like the former, and determinate like the latter. That which in the former, the inner, would be as a number, the outer would have to express in its fashion as multiform actuality, manner of life, color, etc., in general, as the entire host of differences which develop in appearance. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm going to cut that short at 285. So we got 30 whole sections out of the way for today. I hope that y'all come back for part 9, where we will continue talking about the multiform actuality, manner of life, um, and all the host of differences. Thank you so much, and we'll see you very soon. Bye.